Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome to this initial meeting of the Higher Education Subcommittee of Senate Finance and Appropriations. We're glad that you're able to join us today. Uh, you're in for a real treat. We have the State Council of Higher Education here. Peter Blake is going to give us a recap of the spring 2020 semester operations and fiscal impacts, as well as an overview of Federal CARES Act funding and an outlook for fall 2020 semester operations and enrollment. So I'm going to just turn it over to Peter Blake and have him give us those updates. Peter, it's yours.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Members of the subcommittee, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for this opportunity. Let me start, if I may, by stating the obvious, that we're living in historic and transformational times. The last 6 months have upset years of convention and left us wondering what's next, what we should embrace and what we should let go. The times have yielded a range of emotions: anger, amazement, alarm, anxiety, anticipation are just a few. But within higher education, there are a few core facts that remain. As good as we are at instruction, research, and service, we still face many challenges around racial equity. Black and brown students attend and graduate at lower rates than other students. Our faculty members are not as diverse as our students are. The way we finance our higher education system is not aligned with what we say we want from our colleges and universities. And while we've made gains in all of these areas, current conditions, notably the impact of COVID-19, put these gains at risk. That's why we at SHEV, we strongly supported the budget you developed in the 2020 General Assembly session. You made college more affordable, especially for low and middle income students. You provided badly needed funding for faculty and staff salaries. You established a new program whereby community college students could gain degrees in high demand programs at little or no cost to themselves. And you established at SHEV a new program called Guidance to Post-Secondary Success, or GPS, to help students navigate their way to and through college. So this being the first time that I've had to meet with you since January, I wanted to say thank you before we got started. So as the chair said, today's presentation will focus on three broad areas. I thank the chair for meeting with me earlier this year to talk about this presentation, and to Sarah Herzog, of course, for working with us more recently. It's broken into three parts, and I'll pause periodically for your comments. So there's your overview, and Sarah will move along to the timeline of activities on the next page and the next page. And you'll see that we broke this into spring, summer, and fall, and the kinds of issues that we're examining and in which you have expressed an interest deal with safety, students, and learning, and then the fiscal or financial impacts. You know that the college is closed in late March. They performed an amazing pivot where they put over 30,000 courses online in a short period of time. I won't say that it was the optimal conversion. I'm sure some things got dropped and people were put into some very difficult situations as far as the technology they had available to them and how the courses converted. But given the circumstances, it was an outstanding, spectacular effort on behalf of our colleges and universities during that time. Students, of course, had to move to distance learning. There's some question about the quality of those kinds of experiences. I'd be happy to get into that a little bit more if you're interested. And then on the financial side, there were a number of instances with refunds to the colleges. They had additional expenditures, which we'll talk about shortly. So the next slide, Sarah, shows the fiscal impacts just from the spring. And so we break it into two, of course, expenses, and then the lost revenue. On the expense side, colleges, universities, students had to pay for new technology. There was conversion costs. They needed some broadband, some Wi-Fi, cameras on your computers, different kinds of instructional tools that you needed in order to make the conversion to an online environment. You also had, of course, facility cleaning, disinfecting. If you look forward to the fall, you can imagine all those those plastic partitions that are being set up all over campus, just as you've seen at the grocery store, the hardware store, and just about anywhere else you go today. So significant investments in capital facility modification on the expense side. On the lost revenue side, you've heard about refunds. Colleges, universities refunded, $1,000 flat fees in some cases. Some were prorated according to the number of weeks for their resident life experiences, as well as meals and parking refunds and other sorts of things. And then institutions used the summer also for all kinds of on-campus activities for which they receive fees for their services. And so all of those have been canceled as well. So there are expenses, and then there's lost revenues. We did, in cooperation with the colleges, universities, a quick summary early on that showed that the expense impact was somewhere between $50 and $100 million. And I'll come back to that figure in a minute. And the lost revenue was somewhere between $200 and $300 million. We're getting some more updated information that would refine those projections. And we would be happy to report to you later on that. So we'll go to the next slide. So the colleges, I mentioned 50 to 100 million on the expenditure side, 200 to 300 million on the lost revenue side. Here's what we've gotten from the federal government to help colleges, universities. And the big pot of money is the Higher Education Relief Fund, Emergency Relief Fund, the HERF. And that came in the form of institutional support, direct aid to students that could not be used for tuition. That had to be used for direct aid to students for emergency expenses, for technology expenses, other things that they might have needed at the moment. And then minority serving institutions also got an additional provision through the CARES Act, through the HERF funds. And then the US Secretary of Education has discretionary funds. She distributed them early, and then she withdrew them. She brought them all back because I think they had some question about how the funds were being allocated. So she's still holding, Secretary DeVos is still holding the discretionary funds. So I'll show you in a subsequent page how all this breaks down. We also had the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or GERF. That was 66 million. You may have heard about it. The governor put out a press announcement about that last week. That was split between pre-K, higher, and pre-K-12 and higher education. About a third of the total money went to higher education, primarily in the form of grants, student aid to the four-year universities, to Richard Bland, 4.9 million for the community colleges, and then 3.8 million for TAG eligible institutions. The governor also set aside a small amount to the 5 higher education centers, an equal allocation of $175,000 total to the 5 higher education centers. There's also the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund. You'll probably hear from Secretary Lane go into a little bit more detail about that. Higher education is included in that fund. I think the requests that came to the Department of Planning and Budget for the use of that fund are about $95 million, and it could only apply to expenditures. So I mentioned on the previous slide, the early estimate was between 50 and $100 million in expenditure. That figure appears to be corroborated by their requests. The institutions requested coverage of expenditures. They could not request through CARES funding for revenue losses of about $95 million. So that seems to be about a pretty good number of the expenditure side of the equation related to COVID-19, something in the $90 million range. So on the next page, we'll see a summary of the CARES Act and how it all comes together.
I'm working on it.
And so the HERF, the 4 parts of the HERF funding, and this is broken out and it's in millions between the public and private institutions. You'll see that the institutional support and direct aid to students, that was a lump sum. And then the instructions from the feds were that you had to use at least half of that lump sum, the 210 million in the case of the public institutions. You had to use at least half of that in direct aid to students. So the amount that the institutions had available to them to cover lost revenues and expenditures was about 105 million. As I mentioned, the minority serving institutions in Virginia get an additional amount of money, 26.4 at the publics and 14.6 at the privates. And then we're still waiting to see how the discretionary funds will be allocated. There you see the GERF funds. I mentioned 23.4 or 5 million. And so that's split between the publics and the privates. And then you see the CRF funds. The secretary has said that the governor has made the decisions on how those are allocated and I imagine that will be made more widely known here shortly. This does not include a significant amount of money that was included in the CARES, the CRF request from the University of Virginia on behalf of all the colleges and universities to do some additional heightened testing. And so we pulled that one out. That was about $260 million in requested funding for testing. So before I go on, Madam Chair, just pause and see if anybody has any questions about the CARES Act or the fiscal impact in the spring and the summer of COVID.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Ruff.
The breakdown between public and private, was that a calculation based on number of students, or was a different factor used there?
Senator Ruff, what the federal government did, they based it on full-time equivalent students. And I believe there was some adjustment on residential students, not distance learning students.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question about the direct aid to the students. Is that for the semester that they just came out of, or is it going forward?
Madam Chair, the feds authorize institutions to use that either way. So they could have it for current students or students who might be experiencing some financial stress coming up in the fall.
Okay, thank you.
They got a little bit of mixed messaging because on the one hand, the Fed said spend it quickly, get the money into the hands of these students. And on the other hand, the students were already out of classes, and the colleges, universities know that there's going to be additional expenditures for these students in the fall. So I don't have a breakdown of how they've spent it, but they do have longer to spend it if they want to.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? Okay, thank you.
Let's move along then to what happened in the summer. And most colleges, universities, I think all colleges, universities resumed summer school activities. It was all online. We have heard, although we don't have numbers verified yet, that the enrollments for summer generally held up. Even though it was online, they generally held up, particularly at the universities. I'm not quite sure what the community colleges have reported, but at the university level, they appear to be about on par with what they had expected. And also through the summer, the colleges and universities are working on how to open their facilities for in-person instruction safely later this fall. It was during this time also that they have submitted requests to the governor that I've already described relative to the CARES Act funds. The next page talks about the campus reopening. The governor on June the 11th issued the guidance to the colleges, universities on reopening. There are 4 broad categories of guidance around repopulation of the campus, monitoring health conditions, containing the spread once the monitoring of the health condition reveals an infection, and then a shutdown consideration. If you get to the 1st of October and you have to send students home, what are your plans? How are you going to do that? How are you going to protect the students such that they don't lose credit, that they can continue their studies, that they don't lose any money, those sorts of things. So the plans had to address those 4 broad areas. There are a number of subsections within each one of them. And the colleges, universities, all of whom have been working on plans already. So this guidance did not present any surprises to them. They knew that it would have these general parameters. The colleges, universities may need to make some adjustments to it to deal with some of the very specific items that are the kind of the sub bullets underneath each of these 4 broad categories. We work closely primarily with the Virginia Department of Health and the Secretary of Education on putting these together, and the VDH guidance is wholly consistent with everything you've seen on the phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3 reopenings, and the surge capacity at our hospitals in our different communities, the requirement that you have a testing plan in cooperation with your local Department of Health, that you have isolation and quarantine facilities in the event you need to put students in some sort of isolation for a period of time, contact tracing to know where students have been and with whom they've been in touch with, and a variety of different things where the Department of Health has been very good partners with higher education on putting together these very complicated plans that the moment they get reviewed and begin to be implemented, likely will be disrupted by some other condition that we have not yet anticipated. So the governor also at about the same time issued the reopening guidance for K-12. And so with our fingers crossed and being optimistic, we're hoping to get back as close as we can. It won't be the same, as close as we can to getting students back on campus this fall. You may have seen already some of the kinds of announcements that they've proposed. You can skip on, Sarah, to the next page. Some of the announcements that colleges and universities have proposed, starting the semester perhaps a little bit earlier, ending by November, by Thanksgiving. There's a real concern that if students go home, they go back, they become in contact with hundreds and hundreds of other people, and then they bring the virus back to campus when they return. So many of the colleges have announced either completing the semester by Thanksgiving or concluding the semester with online activities and through the rest of the year. So we're seeing some real innovation at our colleges, universities, as far as scheduling, as far as when classes are held, how they're going to do the social distancing, how you reduce density in large classrooms, how you spread instruction out. You'll be adding courses, you'll be staggering who comes to campus at different dates and so forth. A lot of innovation and flexibility whereby colleges are doing everything they can to follow the guidance and to make sure that they're not only their students, but also their faculty, their staff, and the communities are safe as we embark on these unprecedented times for in-person instruction in the fall. You'll see the plans are due on July the 6th. They're due to SHEV. We've also asked institutions to post them on their local websites, college university websites, so we'll be able to, everyone, it'll be a very transparent process. People can see what institutions are going to do. We will review the plans to make sure that they're consistent with the guidance, and that every plan has the components, those 4 broad components that I mentioned. Every plan addresses the items within those plans. And we hope to do that pretty quickly. And then, of course, they don't need to wait for our review in order to continue. In fact, they couldn't. They have to be doing these things right now as far as getting ready for the fall semester. So that's the campus reopening guidance. I'll pause there and see if you have any questions specifically about that.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Senator Howe.
I'm curious about, this is applying not only to the public institutions, but also the private colleges. Are you getting any pushback from any of them about what the governor's authority is?
Senator Howe, no, we have not. We have found that both the public and the private institutions generally support this process. I think it gives them some transparency and some comfort that what they're doing is consistent with some sort of state level public health guidance. I believe most view it as a means of consumer protection for their students to have some confidence that their colleges, universities, public or private, are following certain protocols. So short answer is no, we've not had any pushback from anyone yet.
Senator Locke, Saslaw.
Let me see if Janet has finished. Janet, did you?
Thank you, I'm finished.
Senator Saslaw?
Yeah, Peter, let me ask you this. As you know, our numbers with respect to testing have been steadily going down percentage-wise of positives to the cases given. We're now, it's been 2 weeks where we've been below 10%, and we're approaching almost essentially 5% or less. At what point would you envision where we would have to be in order for things to return to normal? Because I get asked that from time to time.
Senator, I'm not a public health expert, so I can't answer that. But
All right.
but I'll also say normal is going to be redefined, and I don't expect it to be normal throughout the next academic year.
Okay.
I mean, there'll be enough disruption and unusual ways of dealing with this public health crisis, at least for the next year, that it won't be normal.
Okay. Thank you so much, Peter.
Madam Chairman.
Senator Ruff?
Peter, do you see all of this changing us globally? Will more people say, okay, it worked for me. I never thought I would want an online course, but it worked for me this year. How about if I do more of that next year? How about if I wait and only take 2 years of college on campus and 2 years off campus? Is there any discussion of how this is going to affect this?
That's a great question, Senator Ruff. We've been talking about seismic shifts due to technology in higher education for a long time, and it might be here. And so not just with technology, but also with perhaps some of the course taking patterns that you've described. Students might be a little more particular on the program of study that they take. They might be more careful about the amount of debt that they take on. I mean, there's a whole range of things that could be affected by this. So I think the short answer is yes. This has the effect of kind of altering the train that we've kind of become complacent about. And so there is a fair amount of discussion in kind of the academic circles about this, and I'm sure that'll come to you as a policymaker at some point.
Madam Chairman, is each university's board making contingent plans that if they won't meet the expected goals that they had 2 years ago, that they will be drifting down in on-campus student?
Senator, do you mean goals like around enrollment?
Yes.
So I'm sorry.
I guess my point is
ask
we
that
need to
again.
be encouraging them to do that, to be thinking that direction. It may not occur, but we can't plan on a 3% increase if we're going to have a 3% decrease.
That's right. That's right. And some of the colleges, universities, are more are more prepared and have the capacity to ramp up their online activities. There are others that, for historical, traditional, mission-specific reasons, are not as inclined to have that going on. So I think the boards at the institutions are going to have different responses to these challenges that you just described.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, Peter.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, we'll move along, and I'll just share with you a little bit about what we've heard about reopening, and then we'll talk more specifically about enrollment. So, best of our knowledge, last we've heard, the announcements that we've been tracking show that all the public institutions do have plans to have on-campus instruction this year. I mentioned earlier that many plan to either switch to online by Thanksgiving or to finish the semester by Thanksgiving. We anticipate a mix of in-person, online delivery, as I said, smaller classes, less dense, more course sections, kind of staggered attendance in classes. Institutions also are going to have to reduce the capacity in their residential facilities. Mentioned earlier too, having some sort of capacity for isolation and quarantine. These are all part of the plans and part of their reopening announcements. You may have seen that just about every institution has said they'd have no increase or only small increases in tuition and fees. If I may take a side editorial comment here and just observe that we've been saying for a long time that the college university boards are closest to their students. They understand the mission and the market of their students. By not enacting any tuition increases this for the fall term, it clearly illustrates that they have the capacity to understand the mission and their students. So I just wanted to make that observation that they were able to do that with or without an additional appropriation from the General Assembly or any further guidance from the General Assembly. We'll get more information once we see the reopening plans, and we'll be happy to share more of that with you. On the next page, Sarah, we'll talk a little bit about fall enrollments. So colleges, four-year public colleges, universities in Virginia have grown, increased enrollment every year since 1994. So for 25 years straight, they've had a larger enrollment every year successive. We're seeing some changes in demography. We know that the growth in the high school graduating class is not as great as it has been. It's leveling off. We know that also some of the fastest growing segments of our population, low income students, minority students, first generation students, these are students that we in higher education historically have served less well. So and then of course, we haven't even talked about COVID yet. So I'm anticipating that with some pretty stiff headwinds already, that we might see an enrollment decline coming up in the fall. Overlay on top of that then the COVID-19 impact. You have people worrying about the safety of their campus. You have people worried about the safety of their families or of themselves. You have, because of disruption in the employment, you have people with fewer resources to pay for college and all the associated expenses. And then on the international student realm, particularly at our university level, international student enrollment is going to be down 30, 40, 50% for many of the reasons that you can imagine. So we know that there's high anxiety, a lot of apprehension. We already had the prevailing headwinds about enrollment. I would anticipate that enrollment may not be able to continue the increase that it's had for 25 consecutive years. Of course, circumstances can change. Students are watching very closely what happens with their college where they've been accepted and where they think they're going to enroll. If that college, say, were to indicate that it's going to go fully online, might that student who hoped for an on-campus experience say, I think I'll just go to a community college, take a couple of years at a community college? Might students choose to just take a year off? So there's a lot of uncertainty about this. If you go on to the next page, Sarah, we know that many colleges might still want to go to school, but they might choose something closer to home. We've already read some nationally about that students don't want to leave the state, their home state, as much perhaps as they did in the past. Most traditional students don't want 100% online learning based on surveys that we've read and seen. I mentioned some could delay an enrollment for a year. You could call it a gap year, or it could become a permanent gap. I think there's a real risk in not continuing and not launching that career. Students might end up working, they get further away from the culture of a higher education experience. So I'm hoping that people are able to continue to pursue education straight out of high school as they had originally envisioned. I think that's very important. That doesn't mean you can't go back as an adult student, but your chances of success tend to be better if you commit and that you continue your enrollment. So there's a number of uncertainties. We've heard colleges, universities say things to us like, well, it's okay right now. Our deposits are up. The number of dorm rooms appear to be okay, but I'm not going to guarantee anything until, August 29th or the first day of class. So there's a lot of apprehension and uncertainty, even more so than usual. Sarah? I mentioned some of the fastest growing populations being the ones we historically have served less well. Here's a little bit on by race and a factor in student decision making, and this is based on some data from Strata, which is they're a partner with Gallup and does a lot of polling at the national level, and you can see the share of adults by race who have either canceled their plans or materially changed their plans. And you can see the disproportionate effect, particularly for Latino and Black students. Next page. So the commitments, this is what I mentioned, some of the early indicators. The selective institutions appear to be on track, but again, with a fair amount of apprehension and uncertainty until the day that students show up. The less selective institutions, some are on track, some are predicting smaller, a slight decline, not a catastrophic decline. I mean, I think I've read some national surveys early on during the pandemic of 10 to 15, maybe even up to 20% enrollment declines. We're not experiencing that, or the colleges aren't noticing that yet. The community colleges are essentially flat right now, but highly unpredictable. You may know that historically, as unemployment goes up, that community college enrollment also goes up. And so understanding this unemployment situation, understanding that it is different from previous long prolonged ones, and it might be a short deep spike rather than something that's long and prolonged. I'm not sure what the ripple effect will be on the community colleges. Certainly there's an interest in short-term training, the kinds of things that the community colleges do through the Fast Forward program that might be attractive particularly to adult students and to those who are underemployed through this pandemic. We do note one early indicator: the federal financial aid applications, they're down a couple of percentage points. So that could be within the standard of error. Or the standard error. I'm not sure if that's a material difference, but it's not materially increasing. It is down a little bit on the financial aid applications. Dorm deposits, arrival on campus, all that is to be determined. Be happy to get back with you in September, October in that time frame and give you a better picture of the condition of enrollment in the fall. Anything that you're hearing that I might need to know, any of your own personal experiences in your communities, people with whom you're talking, that might help get a better understanding of the enrollment situation? Well, then I'd be happy to go on and talk about on the financial impact a little bit here. We already talked some at the beginning and the CARES. So in addition to the expenditures and revenue losses that colleges, universities experienced in the spring and to the extent more in the summer, they anticipate more. So you mentioned the technology infrastructure, the PPE, the building modifications, sanitizing, disinfectant, masks. I mean, you name it. You see it in every grocery store. As I said, every institution that you would visit these days has these facility modifications and other kinds of extraordinary efforts that they're taking to keep the public safe. So that will be an additional cost. The revenue losses, we don't know what the impact will be on enrollment. Certainly, there will be some, and again, colleges chose not to increase tuition, so they're not getting any additional revenue on the tuition side either. Auxiliary services, they have many fixed costs. They have debt service that they need to pay. If there's a substantial disruption in auxiliaries, if students get sent home midway through the semester, colleges have to refund certain dorm fees and meal fees that could have a significant impact on some of these fixed costs within the auxiliary enterprises. So we'll be monitoring that. On the research front, I'm pleased to say that I did speak to some of the vice presidents of research at our universities today. They said they're getting back into the labs. They're doing it in a public health way, but they're getting back into the labs in order to continue their research. And so we're hoping that can pick up and that they can continue to be beacons for research and discovery and innovation. We've seen a little bit of softening on endowments and giving. That's too short term to know whether that's a permanent modification in institutions' fundraising abilities, but we've seen a little softening of that. And then, of course, your big picture in front of you are state budget reductions. And again, you'll get a clear picture as you get ready for your special session and look at the revenue reforecast that I think is coming out in mid-August. And you'll have a better picture then of what the impact will be across the Commonwealth and how that will be shouldered by our colleges and universities. I mentioned at the beginning, Sarah, on the next page, some budget considerations that I'd leave you with. This was a significant year for higher education. You added over $380 million. I mentioned the kinds of things: institutional funding, the tuition moderation, the G3 initiative. This is the reduced low-cost community college initiative, undergraduate financial aid, the largest increase in any biennium ever. And we're very grateful for your commitment, doubling down, particularly in the first year for student need-based financial aid. You had an affordability pilot program at Norfolk State and Virginia State University, increase in the tuition assistance grant program, and a handful of other things that you see over there on the right-hand side. These considerations focused on closing gaps in attainment through affordability and making college and university more accessible, and also providing services to the students with the highest needs. It was a remarkable budget. Senator Howe, I just remember your comments on the floor or in a committee when you were just kind of crushed with what you were having to do as a result of the unallotment of the funding for colleges, universities. And so when you come together again in August or whenever it is that happens, we'd like for you to keep a couple of things in mind. And I'll just go on to the next page, Sarah, and just have you, again, as you did earlier, to maintain your budget priorities on affordability and improving credential attainment, particularly in some high demand areas, and what you did through the G3 program. Your affordability and financial aid initiatives were enormous. Consider the impact on the institutions and the students they serve. Not every institution is different. Not every student body is the same. You have varying missions. You have varying capacities to raise tuition, to cover the costs of university operations. Some have greater capacity, some have lesser capacity. Some students need more resources, some students need fewer resources. So understand the differences of our colleges, universities as you go out about making budget decisions. And then just make the note that the students that serve the most vulnerable students often have the fewest resources, and they rely more heavily on state funds. And so again, kind of this balance and a recognition of the differences. Again, I think your budget from March really embodied a lot of the priorities that you see here. Real quickly on just a couple of things that Chev's doing. We're staying very much close up to date with money committee staff and the governor's folks and the institutions on enrollment, on budget impact. We've been working with what's called the Op6 group, made up of your staff director and others around Capitol Square, working with the colleges, universities to assess the impact of all these different disruptions that they're facing. We've run a variety of what if scenarios. So what if enrollment's down 10%, what will be the fiscal impact? What if students get sent home halfway through the semester? What might be the impact on the auxiliary enterprises? For example, we have already put in place a number of internal policy changes that we could enact without legislative cover to make to try to improve the situation, to reduce the burden on the institutions, to give them greater flexibility to serve students where they are at particular times. We're regularly, through our convening role, meeting with the presidents, the chief financial officers, the chief academic officers, your government liaison, the college university government liaisons, and again, bringing in the legislative staff on all of those different discussions. We're updating all of our provisions relating to student loans and student protections. This could be a particularly dicey time, perhaps, for students who default on their loans, who might need to delay a payment on their loan. And we want to make sure that they're not disadvantaged in any kind of material way that would prevent them from being on the right side of being able to pay off their debts and to meet their obligations. I meet regularly with the folks, Senator Locke from Southern Regional Education Board, as well as across the nation, to identify best practices. Like you, I've been on more Zoom calls with more people than I've ever imagined. I'm totally confused, but through all of that, you do learn some best practices. You do see what other states are doing. And I'm happy to share any of those with you at any time as well. So we're involved in a lot of different activities. Be happy to do more if you want to give us some suggestions on things we should be doing. Let me close with just a couple of thoughts around higher education equity. This is a priority for the council, for you, for the governor, across the Commonwealth, the institutions. We did have a successful partnership with the Lumina Foundation, which is one of the largest beneficent organizations for higher education. They provided a $500,000 grant to Chev to try to reduce educational attainment disparities, particularly among African American, Latin, and Native American students. As you may know, we have significant learning and achievement gaps, and so we're hoping to use that money to do some interventions in communities, in our colleges, within Chev, to try to better position us to address some of these disparities across the Commonwealth. We know that the COVID-related consequences could result in wider attainment gaps. I mentioned this earlier. Clearly, the evidence shows there's disparate impact of COVID-19 by race, We've seen disrupted school year and summer learning activities that could have an unequal impact by race, ethnicity, by income level. We know also with disrupted employment and income that could have some detrimental effects that either even further exacerbate the inequities that we see in the achievement gaps that we are experiencing in Virginia. And then I already mentioned technology. The digital divide is real. And it's not just broadband, but it's whether or not you can afford it, even if you do have access to it, whether you have the technology at home and you know how to use it effectively. There's a whole host of things that are related to the digital divide and technology. You'll see more institutions are putting together what has been called an initiative called Equity in Action, that it's still nascent, but coming together as the public college university presidents. The governor has the nation's first director of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Dr. Underwood, and she's putting together a statewide diversity and inclusion plan. The colleges, universities needed to and submitted a plan. I think the date was June 1st related to that. So she's assembling that. And there are other initiatives within SHEV, the Secretary of Education, through his reopening task force, has created several subcommittees to look at some issues that might have some long-term impact, long-term policy impact that relate to educational attainment. So there's a number of things in the equity realm right now. It has captured the attention of policymakers at all levels and across the Commonwealth and across the nation. Final thoughts on my last page, Madam Chair. There is substantial federal funding in Virginia, and there might be more. We think it's needed. It filled substantial gaps, particularly on the expenditure side, but not as much on the lost revenue side. And we also know that colleges, universities will have additional expenditures coming up this fall. So while it helped, it didn't make the colleges whole. I mentioned earlier that institutions are impacted differently based on the revenue mix and the types of students they serve and their mission. So as you make budget decisions, I hope you're cognizant, or I hope you will take that difference into consideration as you make your decisions about budget increases or budget reductions. I mentioned the gaps, particularly by race and income, which already are substantial, could get worse as a result of COVID and the funding disruptions. And that has to be ever present in front of us. And therefore, the solutions to the budget and policy issues need to consider these equity issues. So I'll pause. I really appreciate the chance to be with you and to hear you. The last couple of pages break down the CARES Act funding by institution, in case you want to take a look at that at your leisure some other time or right now. So, Madam Chair, thank you for this and for the chance to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Peter. Appreciate all of this information that you've provided us with. It's quite a bit and quite a lot of food for thought. Are there any questions for Peter? Your presentation can be made available to us, correct?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
All right. And that we know that COVID has disrupted all aspects of our lives, and it certainly has had an impact on higher education and all aspects of education, as you've demonstrated to us here today. I do have a question about grades. Do you know how many of the institutions did pass-fail as the option for grades this past semester?
Senator, I'd like to get back with you with something a little more definitive instead of just speaking to it. I believe many institutions gave that as an option. I'm not sure that it applied universally to all students, but let me get you something a little more definitive on that.
Okay. All right.
John Edwards here. Peter, I have a question.
Senator Edwards.
Yeah. Peter, I don't know how you answer this question, or can you? But what is the criteria under the CARES Act for splitting, for how the money is to be divided? Is there some general formula that's easy to understand, or is it much too complicated? The CARES Act, how do they split up the money?
Yeah, so Senator, the the bulk of the money that went to the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, the HERF, was divided based primarily on full-time equivalent student enrollment, with an extra weighting to those students who were Pell Grant eligible. So if you were a Pell eligible institution that served more Pell eligible students, you got a little bit extra money. So it was driven by overall full-time equivalent enrollment, plus an overlay of Pell eligibility, plus it was for residential instruction only, not online learning. So those are the three primary factors. And then they allocated the money to the institutions and said that you had to use at least half of it for direct student aid. So not financial aid to pay tuition, but direct aid to students for emergency purposes, to cover the cost of a new computer, to cover the cost of your rent payment for the month, or any number of emergency kinds of things that students needed. So that was the instructions that came from the feds and how they determined the total amount to be allocated to individual institutions.
I have a second question. It has to do with residential colleges and universities, of which, we have tons of them. I understand JMU is using I've read anyway, a process that the first and second year students, freshmen and sophomores, would be residential, but the third and fourth year students would not be. And that way, I guess you could have fewer people in the residential facilities. Is there a formula that the universities are using? Because it seems to me that's going to be a huge issue in terms of COVID-19, how close people are going to be with each other, especially in residential colleges, universities. Is there some kind of a formula? How's that working?
Yeah, Senator, there's no statewide formula for that. The colleges, universities are following the guidance from the Centers for Disease Control and the Virginia Department of Health and others to determine what are safe density levels. And that pertains not just to the bedroom or the sleeping arrangement area, but also to bathrooms and other kinds of common spaces. So I'm assuming what James Madison and all the other institutions have done and are doing is looking at capacity today versus capacity last year. And I guess James Madison has concluded that they cannot meet the public health requirements for distance by having the same number of students. And so they've asked the other students to go off campus. So there's no statewide formula for that, but I know every college university is looking at density within their residential units to meet certain safety concerns. Now, that raises an interesting question in some of the communities where, what housing is available in certain communities. And it might put some pressures on some of those communities as well. So I think I read something in the Roanoke Times about Virginia Tech and Blacksburg trying to find the appropriate balance between who lives on campus and who lives off campus. So those are the kinds of questions and these kind of remarkable challenges that everyone, the colleges, universities are facing across the Commonwealth.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, we are going to go ahead and wrap up, and so that people can set up for the next subcommittee that meets at 3:30. So thank you again, Peter. We'll be talking soon, I'm sure, as we prepare for the fall semester for our institutions of higher education.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any last words?
That's it. For those of you that are on the 3:30 subcommittee, you have a quick break before you log on for that one.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you for calling in. Appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon if you're not at the 3:30 meeting. Thank you.